Hey, I'm back to talk about another Plymouth book. This one is Laura Russell Rembers, an old Plymouth Manuscript, with notes by Marion Channing and illustrations by Jane Cooper Baker. And here you can see an illustration of Laura's house. And below it says, born in 1827, Miss Russell recalls her life and its customs when she was young. Unfortunately, this book is out of print. I bought this at a used book sale. I did check online, and you can buy it used online. At the book sale, they wanted $15 for it, but I got it for $10, and I would have actually paid that $15. I would have paid more. That's how much I liked this book. It was really interesting to me. I couldn't put it down. I read the whole thing in one sitting. It's not that long, but I couldn't put it down. So in the introduction, Laura says, "It has often been urged by those who have read this record that it was worthy of publication, but the author has shrunk from subjecting it to the keen judgment of the impartial critic. Of late, however, the pressure has been brought to bear, and the old scruples have been overcome. Although the same field has been partially occupied by later writers, yet they have left unreaped gain which is worth the harvesting." So Marion, in her notes, said she didn't really understand quite what she meant by scruples and pressure, but I think it's fairly obvious. I think her friends and family saw the value of what she had to say and were urging her to publish it, to share it with the world. And her scruples were probably that someone had already written about this time period. There's another book. It's called Memoirs of a Plymouth Octogenarian. It takes place in the 1830s, same time period as Laura. I haven't read that one yet. I have to get that one. So she probably was kind of thinking, like, who am I to step on this guy's toes and publish a book of memories about the same time period? But the thing is, everybody has their own unique perspective and experiences, especially with something historical like that. You're adding to the story. It doesn't hurt to have your own observations and memories put out there. It's only gonna create a greater picture of the time period. So I'm glad she published that. Laura came from a wealthy family, so her experiences might not be quite the average experiences. But she also came from what she calls a progressive family, so in that sense, it also might not be quite that typical. So her manuscript takes place during the 1830s, during her entire childhood. So I think this would be a really great book to have children in school read. They'd really be able to step into history, sort of, and get an idea of what everyday life was like for a child back in the 1830s. She talks about school, toys, games they played, as well as just the people in town and conversations she remembers, the clothing of the time period. She goes into a lot of detail. I think it would be really great in school for kids. But also, if you like history or are a woman and are interested in seeing the fashion of the time, what was expected of you, the customs, it would probably interest you as well. So children back then would start school between the ages of 20 months and 2 years, and they would have to go to school 6 days a week, and they would not miss school. They would go every day, no matter the weather. It could be raining, it could be snowing. They had to walk there. Luckily for Laura, her nursery school was right down the street from her, so it wasn't that far of a walk. And the children would come home for lunch, and then they would go back to school for the afternoon. They didn't really get days off. She said that the only time that they would get a half day off was when another child died and they would have to attend the funeral. And she said while this was a sad event, it was also a good day for them because they would have time to play after the funeral, and that was something that they didn't usually have time for. In the notes, it was mentioned that one year, 67 children in town died from scarlet fever, and so they would use other children to be the pallbearers and carry the coffin, and a lot of times these children didn't even know the child that died. They were just called in to do that. That's crazy. It sounds very traumatizing to have 67 children in a community die all within a year. So at her nursery school, she learned sewing and knitting and embroidery and reading. And these were really small young children, toddlers basically, learning all these things. That's really amazing. Even the boys were learning to sew. So one kind of small but very interesting detail about her school that I found really interesting was that it was run by this old woman in her house, and every week she would bring in fresh sand and spread it on the floor instead of a rug, and she would use a broom to make these patterns in it. That sounds really, really pretty, but also really messy. I can't quite see how that works, but it was very interesting. I'd like to see like an example of that done in some kind of a historic house or something. It sounds really, really cool. So, as I said, they didn't have a lot of time to play, but her family was very progressive in their thinking for girls, and they let her do a lot of things that other little girls wouldn't get to do when she did have some free time for play. One thing was that she would get to go sledding, and they didn't make sleds for children back then, so she had her own specially made for her. And another thing that she mentioned that she thought she liked to do as a child, but looking back as an adult realized she didn't, it probably really wasn't as fun of a time as she thought it was playing football with her brother. She said that she would get to hold the ball and he would do most of the kicking, which you have to consider she wasn't really dressed for that either. He, would be wearing pants and boots or whatever, and she would be in a dress, and the shoes that she had just, never fit really well. She said they came from a shoemaker in Plymouth, and he just couldn't get them to fit on the girl's feet right, no matter how many times they complained. They were kind of like a ballet shoe slipper type of a thing. They would lace up the ankle. But she said on either side of her feet there would be a space, and she could fit 3 fingers in on either side. So you have to imagine she's getting mud and snow and rain all in her shoes. It couldn't have been very comfortable, and I don't think she'd really want to kick a ball in shoes like that. So back then, football wasn't really quite a thing yet, and it was more kind of like soccer, I think, like a cross between the two. Soccer and football were kind of a cross between each other. And the ball was from an animal's stomach that they preserved. They pickled it in a jar, and then they would take it out when they wanted to play, and they would use a pipe or straw to inflate it, and it really sounds like it was a lot of work just to play a game of football. And she was also really lucky in that she had a lot of dolls, and she described them. I found that really interesting because I collect old dolls, and I just like dolls, so I enjoyed that part. Laura was the youngest of 4 children. She had a brother and she had 2 older sisters. And so even though they were a wealthy family, they dressed the children very plain, simple clothing. And not only that, but she's the youngest, so she got all the hand-me-downs. And she said she would live in fear of a wind coming and blowing up her skirt and exposing her petticoat, because back then a child would get a petticoat, it would be hemmed up to start, and they would just keep letting it down as the child grew. So she had her older sister, passed it on to the middle sister, passed it on to her, so by the time she got it, it had all these stripes, yellowed stripes from being washed and hemmed up and down. I thought it was really amazing that she could remember these everyday simple conversations that weren't about anything that spectacular, but still really interesting, and then give you an idea of what people were like back then. But she could remember the details of these conversations, even though she wasn't necessarily in the conversation. It might have just been something she overheard. But I was thinking, back then, they didn't have all these TV shows or the internet, song lyrics, all these things taking up space in their mind, so they were probably more focused. And there was more room in their memory for the conversations around them and what was going on around them. That's just my theory. So one of these characters in the town that she talks about was a gypsy, or she refers to her as a gypsy anyways, and I just found her so interesting. So back then, in the kind of outskirts of town in the woods, there was a lot of people living that they referred to as vagrants, and they were just living, kind of camping in the woods. They didn't really have any jobs or anything. They're just living off the land in the woods, I guess. And this is what she has to say about this woman. There was one among these vagrants whose visits we enjoyed. She was called Molly Ebbett, though I do not think that was her real name, and was of a true gypsy type, with strongly marked features and a skin as wrinkled and brown as a baked apple. She carried a pack on her back, a long staff in her hands, and in her pocket a pack of greasy cards with which she would tell the fortunes of anyone who would give her a little money or even cold food. She lived to a great age, but like the rest has long since passed away. I would love to know more about Molly Ebbett. I'm hoping that she's in that other book, mentioned in that other book, because I'd like to read more about her. And then another person, the person I probably liked the most, was her cousin Sally. I thought there was a drawing of her, but there's not. Her cousin Sally. So when she was a child, she had this adult cousin that was a lot older than her, named Sally. And Sally lived with her brother, and they were, what she says, of reduced means, and they lived in a secluded kind of life. They never left the house or the yard. And I think they kind of lived in like a quieter part of town where people didn't really go. And it sounds almost like they were kind of agoraphobic. They just never left home, ever. Sally would send people to get whatever she needed from the store and bring it back to her. And I guess when she was younger, she was very beautiful and had many admirers and offers of marriage, but she never wanted to leave her home. And one time, this admirer was there, trying, I don't know, maybe proposing to her or something, or just kind of putting her in a spot. And to get away, Sally jumped out the window so she wouldn't have to continue talking to him. That was really funny. And so, since she never left home and she always had to send people to get what she needed, she didn't really know, like, all the stores in town. And when her brother died, it was, like, the rarest occasion. She finally went out and walked in the funeral procession to the graveyard to bury her brother. And Laura said that Sally was, like, looking very carefully in the store windows as she passed and reading all the signs, so she would know what was in town. I thought that was cute, too. Another thing she talks about is the Plymouth Waterworks, which was actually in this area, the Billington Sea area. It brought water from a smaller pond into town, and she says it was wooden pipes, like logs that were hollowed out. That sounds crazy. I really want to read more about that. I've seen like an old drawing of the Plymouth Waterworks, but I didn't really ever think much about it or like what the Plymouth Waterworks were. So that's something else I'd like to read more about, whether it's in that other book or I can find more information about it. I'm interested. All right. So I think that's all I have to say. As I said, this is a really like hard to put down book. I know a little bit about the 1830s, but not that much. I feel like I know a lot more now, just like what everyday life was like. And if you like history or that sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend it. So if you can find it, you should check that out. Laura Russell Remembers, an old manuscript of Plymouth. Well, thanks for watching. See you next time.
If you see this ghoul, play it cool.